The sea spray still stung the salt-caked skin on his forearms when the gates of Troy finally fell. But in Nolan's telling, that grit is already washed clean. The director hands you a hero who is polished, steeled, and certain. A man whose cleverness is a weapon drawn from a sheath, gleaming and effortless. Yet the moment you scratch the surface of the older sources, that gleaming blade starts to tarnish, and a very different figure emerges from the smoke. This is not the Odysseus of the multiplex. This is the wanderer whom the ancients themselves found deeply troubling, a man so marked by his own violations that the gods refused to let him rest. And the point Nolan missed is not a battle detail or a plot twist. It is the quiet engine of consequence that drove every mile of that voyage home. Consider the first image most of us carry, the one the modern film polished to a mirror shine. Odysseus stands at the prow, jaw set, eyes fixed on the horizon, a leader who has just won the war. That is what many believe, but the reality is different. The Homeric epics paint a portrait of a man who wins by cunning, yes, but also by cruelty that borders on recklessness, a man whose first instinct after victory is not to sail home, but to plunder the coast of the Cicones. That choice, buried in the opening of the Odyssey, is the seed of nearly everything that follows. If you have ever sensed that the history you were taught is incomplete, you already know the discomfort of being handed a tidy version of a story that was never tidy at all. The film gives you a linear journey, a straight line from ruined Troy to the hearth of Ithaca, interrupted by monsters, but never derailed by meaning. The oldest texts tell another story entirely, and the very first loop we need to close hangs on that plunder of Ismarus. Odysseus and his men sack the city. They take the spoils, and instead of leaving, they linger. They linger for days, feasting on the shore, and that delay costs them dearly. His own crew is decimated by a counterattack, and the survivors are left with grief and an uneasy conscience. Now watch what happens next. That guilt does not simply evaporate with the morning tide. It follows them onto the water, and it poisons every subsequent encounter. This is the forgotten principle, the one the movie smooths over. Odysseus's tragedy is not his cleverness. It is his inability to know when to stop. The second loop opens in the same shadow, and it is more personal. Nolan's Odysseus is a man of action, but the Homeric hero is a man of words. Words that wound, words that deceive, and words that leave his own men terrified of him. When they reach the land of the Lotus Eaters, some of his crew taste the flowering plant and lose all desire to return home. The drug is not a monster. It is a quiet seduction, a forgetting so gentle that the men weep when they are forced back to the ships. The modern adaptation reads this as a simple obstacle. The ancients read it as a warning about the fragility of purpose. Odysseus drags his men back by force, but he drags them into a future where their will has already been weakened. The real voyage is not a physical map, but a moral unraveling, and each stop peels away another layer of discipline. That quiet seduction of forgetting is what makes the Lotus Eaters far more dangerous than any monster. Subscribe if you want to keep peeling back the layers of stories you thought you knew, because the next loop is even more unsettling. Write the word forgetting in the comments. If this reading of the Odyssey is different from what you were taught, I want to know what else you're rethinking. Here is where the archaeology begins to speak louder than the poetry. The late Bronze Age world that Homer describes is not a fantasy realm. It is a real network of palaces and ports that did collapse into ruin. At sites like Pylos and Mycenae, excavators have found the charred remains of storerooms and the clay tablets that survived the fires, listing the inventories of kingdoms on the edge of destruction. The world Odysseus sails through is a world that was disappearing under his feet. The smell of burnt olive oil and wet limestone is not a metaphor. It is the literal residue of a civilization that choked on its own complexity, and the sea routes Odysseus travels were the arteries of that fragile system. Nolan's camera lingers on the monsters, but the real horror is the silence of the ports that were already empty. That silence is a sensory shock, and you can almost feel it in your chest. Picture yourself standing on a Mycenaean quay in the twilight of the 13th century before Christ, watching the last ships leave. The smell of the harbor is an odd blend of pitch, brine, and the smoke of signal fires. Beneath your feet, the stones are worn smooth by generations of sailors, but no one is coming ashore tonight. The palatial bureaucracies that once moved grain and bronze across the Mediterranean were brittle, over-centralized, and utterly dependent on uninterrupted trade. When the supply lines frayed, the palaces did not merely weaken. They starved, and the people who depended on them scattered. Odysseus's journey is set against this backdrop, a world where the very idea of a safe return was becoming impossible for everyone, not just for one king with a clever tongue. Now consider what the old sources actually say about the hero's most famous triumph, the blinding of the Cyclops. In the film, this is a moment of pure ingenuity, a victory of the underdog. But the Homeric text is far more uncomfortable. When Odysseus and his men are trapped in the cave, he does outwit the giant, yes, but the way he does it reveals a darker instinct. He tells Polyphemus that his name is nobody, so that when the Cyclops cries out for help, he shouts that nobody is killing him, and his neighbors ignore him. It is brilliant. It is also a direct violation of the sacred rules of hospitality, the bond of Xenia that Greeks believed was protected by Zeus himself. Odysseus does not just defeat a monster. He mocks a god's law, and he compounds the crime by taunting the blinded giant from his ship as he sails away. That final boast, revealing his real name, was not pride. It was provocation. The consequences of that provocation ripple through the rest of the saga, and this is the point the movie refuses to face. Polyphemus prays to his father, the god of the sea, and asks for vengeance. The prayer is not a vague plea, it is a precise curse that Odysseus will lose all his companions and arrive home late and broken, in a stranger's ship, to find only ruin. And that is exactly what happens. Every single one of his men dies before he reaches Ithaca. The clever hero who outsmarted a giant won his freedom at the cost of his entire crew, and the gods were willing to grant that curse because Odysseus had already crossed a line that the ancient world took with absolute seriousness. He had violated the bond of guest and host, and no amount of wit could outrun that debt. This is the layer of evidence that the modern retelling simply cannot accommodate. Nolan's Odysseus is a warrior with a plan, but the Homeric Odysseus is a man who carries a transgression that colors every interaction he has from that moment forward. Even when he reaches the island of the goddess Circe, where his men are turned into swine, the story is not simply an escape from a sorceress. It is a test of his own moral compass. Circe warns him that before he can return home, he must sail to the very entrance of the underworld and consult the spirit of the blind prophet Tiresias. The hero, who wanted nothing but to return home, is forced to descend into the realm of the dead, not to rescue someone, but to ask how to survive his own cursed journey. That descent changes him, and the film's inability to sit with that darkness is the reason it misses the larger picture. That darker truth, the one the film could not sit with, is exactly why these ancient texts still hold sway. When you subscribe, you're not just watching history, you're learning to read the undercurrents that shaped everything that followed. Tell me in the comments, what detail from the Homeric account hit you harder? The curse itself, or the fact that it actually came to pass? Remember that first loop, the one about the plunder of Ismarus. Here is where it bites. When Odysseus stands before the spirits of the dead, the first ghost he encounters is one of his own men, Elpenor, a young sailor who fell from Circe's roof in a drunken stupor. Elpenor begs for a proper burial, and Odysseus, standing at the edge of the abyss, is forced to confront the cost of his leadership. His men are dying not because of monsters, but because of their own exhaustion and despair, and he is the one who led them into that spiral. The real enemy is not the Cyclops or the Sirens. It is the accumulating weight of bad decisions, and the ghosts are there to remind him of every single one. The movie wants a hero. The epic gives you an undertaker. Let that sit for a moment, because the inversion is the heart of the whole enterprise. We have been told this is a story about a warrior's journey home, but it is actually a story about the unraveling of a man's claim to honor. The Trojan War itself was fought over an act of betrayal, the violation of hospitality by Paris, who stole his host's wife. And Odysseus, the man who devised the wooden horse that ended the war, becomes, in his own journey, a violator of that same sacred law. He is the mirror of the very crime he was sent to punish. That symmetry is not accidental, and it is the forgotten principle that Nolan's film smooths into a generic arc of perseverance. The ancient audience would have recognized it instantly. The hero who breaks the rules to win is doomed to be broken by the rules he broke. The evidence stacks higher when you look at the other places Odysseus lands, and the pattern is relentless. He and his men are trapped in the cave of the Cyclops because they accepted his hospitality without realizing the danger. They are nearly destroyed by the Laestrygonians, a race of cannibal giants, because they sailed into a seemingly peaceful harbor without caution. The sirens seduce with song, and Odysseus has his men plug their ears with wax, while he, bound to the mast, listens to the melody that promises knowledge of everything. Every single encounter is framed by the ethics of approach, of how a guest is received and how a host behaves. And every time Odysseus succeeds, it is because he either respects the boundary, or more often, because he wildly oversteps it and pays the price. The monsters are not the story. The boundaries are the story. By the time the wanderer reaches the island of the Phaeacians, a people who finally offer him genuine hospitality, the contrast is so sharp you can almost feel the texture of the clean linen they give him to wear. He is ragged, naked, and weeping on the shore when he is found by the king's daughter, and he has been stripped of everything: his ships, his men, his glory. The Phaeacians are the counterpoint to every violation he has committed, because they treat him exactly as a guest should be treated. And it is in that moment of being cared for that he finally breaks down and tells the true story of his wanderings. The audience for that story is not Nolan's theater crowd. It is a king and queen who understand the weight of what he is confessing. The entire Odyssey, in a sense, is a tale told at a dinner table, and the only way Odysseus can earn his way home is by becoming a guest who honors the law he once broke. This is the point where the title's promise must fully land, and it has two layers of evidence standing behind it. The first layer is the ancient text itself, which is not a clean adventure, but a dense meditation on the ethics of hospitality, vengeance, and the limits of cleverness. The second layer is the archaeological reality of the late Bronze Age collapse, a real historical catastrophe that saw the palaces of the Mycenaean world destroyed and abandoned, a world where the sea routes Odysseus travels were literally falling apart. Put those two layers together, and you get a story that is not about a hero overcoming obstacles, but about a man trying to navigate a world that is itself disintegrating. The film's Odysseus is fighting monsters. The real Odysseus is fighting the collapse of everything he knew, and he is losing almost every step of the way. Now, the connection to your own world. If you have ever watched a modern war film and sensed that the tidy, heroic narrative was hiding something deeper, you know exactly how the ancient audience would have felt about Nolan's take. The same blindness that the movie perpetuates still shapes how we tell stories about power and consequence. We want our heroes to be clever and triumphant, without asking what their cleverness costs. But the epic asks that question relentlessly. Odysseus's shipmates are all dead because he could not stop pushing his luck. He returns home to a palace overrun by suitors who have spent years consuming his wealth, and he kills them all, a massacre that the gods themselves debate. The hero who wanted peace brings nothing but more violence, and the cycle of bloodshed is only interrupted when Athena, the goddess of wisdom, forces a truce. The film leaves you cheering. The epic leaves you wondering if the victory was worth the price. What did Nolan actually miss? It is not a single detail, and it is not the absence of a particular monster. What the film missed is the entire moral architecture that makes the original story endure. The Odyssey was never a story about a clever man beating obstacles. It is a story about a man who learns, through catastrophic suffering, that his own intelligence is a trap, that his refusal to respect limits is the source of his pain. The ancient world did not celebrate Odysseus without reservation. Later, Greek playwrights portrayed him as a liar, a manipulator, and a man of dubious virtue, and the philosopher Plato used him as an example of a soul corrupted by pride. Nolan's Odysseus would not have recognized himself in those accounts. The real Odysseus is not a role model. He is a warning. And that warning, the slow accumulation of consequences that no amount of wit can evade, is the true story the movie smoothed into a polished, marketable arc. That is what stays with you, the warning that the ancient world understood and our modern retellings too often erase. If you want to keep excavating the real architecture beneath the stories we think we know, subscribe to this channel. There is much more of the original epic left to uncover before we close this chapter. Let me know in the comments. Was there a moment in the film where you felt the deeper consequence was glossed over? Or did the warning still survive in some small gesture you noticed? There is a physical image that has stayed with me from the time I first read the full epic, and it is the image of the hero sitting on the shore of Ogygia, the island of the nymph Calypso, who has kept him as her lover for 7 years. The film can afford to skip this entire chapter because nothing happens, no monsters, no battles. But the text is explicit about the emotional weight. Odysseus sits on the beach every day, staring at the sea, weeping. He's not weeping because he is afraid. He is weeping because he is a man who has finally been forced to sit still, and all the grief he has been outrunning finally catches up to him. The cleverest hero in all of Greece is reduced to a figure of pure longing, and there is nothing intellectual about his pain. It is a physical ache, the salt of his tears mixing with the salt of the spray, and it is the only honest emotion he has shown in years. That image is the key to the quiet truth at the center of the whole saga. The forgotten principle is not about sheep stealing of the suitors. It is about the unbearable weight of being human, the necessity of limitation. Odysseus's entire journey is a lesson in learning to accept that he cannot control everything, that his words and his lies have consequences, that the gods do not exist to be mocked. By the time he finally reaches Ithaca and reveals himself to his faithful wife, through the secret of their marriage bed, he is not the same man who left it 20 years earlier. He has been stripped down to nothing and rebuilt, And the rebuilding is not into a more efficient warrior, but into a man who can finally stop, who can finally accept what he has. The last thing the epic does is end. It stops, abruptly, at the moment when the cycle of violence is just barely contained. There is no triumphant march into the sunset. There is only a truce, and the sense that the bloodshed could begin again at any moment. So when you watch the movie again, watch what Nolan chooses to leave out. He leaves out the weeping on the shore. He leaves out the ghost of the fallen sailor demanding a burial. He leaves out the hero's own admission that his cleverness brought ruin to his men. And because he leaves those out, he leaves out the entire poetic architecture of consequence that makes Homer's work one of the most influential stories ever told. The point is not that the movie is wrong about the details. It is wrong about the meaning. It gives you a hero who succeeds because he is brilliant. The epic gives you a man who survives because he finally learns to grieve. That is the true story of Odysseus, and it is the point Nolan missed. The wind carries the smell of the open sea past the last pale stones of the palace, and for a moment, the shore is empty, as if the hero were still out there, still weeping on some distant beach. The sun drops behind the ruins of Mycenae, and the shadows lengthen over the walls that he once called home. But the story does not end with his return, because in the next telling of this myth, the gods themselves will sit in judgment over what he did in that final hall. And the question they ask, the one the epic never fully answers, is whether a man who has conquered every monster must still be held accountable for his own. That thread, the true cost of the homecoming, is the one worth pulling next, and it will lead somewhere darker than any sea route the wanderer ever sailed.